When the black woman reveals her USSS badge in court, the judge freezes after laughing at her. "Think you're more knowledgeable about the law than I am?" The judge sat back in his chair and scoffed, his voice brimming with conceit. With everyone's attention on the composed black woman in front of him, the courtroom went silent. She didn't falter or flinch. Instead, with a secret that would soon alter everything, she quietly confronted his patronizing look. The judge would be left doubting everything he believed to be true as what transpired next rocked the room. The Fulton County Courthouse's tall glass windows let in the morning sun, which left long striations of light on the marble floors. There was a buzz of excitement in the courtroom, the type of excitement that arises when lives are on the line. Angela Monroe sat at the defendant's table with her hands folded neatly in front of her and her posture upright. Her beautiful brown eyes took in every detail as they examined the room. The prosecutor's self-satisfied grin, the silent murmurs of the audience, and the jury's steady but slightly critical eyes. Marcus Monroe, her brother, sat next to her, his hands clutching the table's edge as if it were the only thing keeping him in check. He was a man in his early 30s, tall and broad-shouldered. Weeks of unrelenting accusations eroded his normal confidence. Even though there was video evidence to the contrary, the charge of resisting arrest hovered over him like a rain cloud. Angela put a comforting hand on his and reached over. "Remain composed, Marcus," she said in a steady, calming voice. "Just wait a little while longer, and the truth will always come out." A silence descended upon the courtroom as Judge Bernard Whitman marched to his seat, his black robe billowing as the huge wooden doors creaked open. He had a sharp nose, thinning white hair, and an aura of self-importance that preceded him. He was a man in his late 60s. It wasn't only a hearsay that he was known for being harsh and frequently biased. Among his peers, it was essentially a badge of pride. With a strong voice that reverberated off the walls, the bailiff declared that court was now in session. Judge Whitman took a seat in his high-back chair and looked around the room with a contemptuous expression that hardly disguised his fatigue. His lips formed a slight smirk as his gaze fell onto Angela, as if he had already made up his mind about her. He mumbled, barely audible but loud enough for the front rows to hear, "Let's get this over with." Angela did not recoil. She had already dealt with men like him, folks who evaluated her beauty before her words and who looked at her skin tone before her qualifications. Like water on stone, she had learned to let their haughtiness wash away from her. Daniel Reed, the prosecutor, stood up theatrically, fiddling with his tie as though he were getting ready for a show. "Your Honor," he said, his confidence brimming, "the defendant is clearly in the wrong. No number of justifications can change the fact that this is an instance of flagrant disrespect for law enforcement." Angela's mouth clenched, but she said nothing. Even though she wanted to step up and correct the record with all her heart, she had promised Marcus that she would let the lawyers do their work. Reed went on, presenting Marcus as a dangerous, erratic individual who threatened society. Every half-truth and every exaggeration made Angela's stomach turn. He smirked with satisfaction as he sat down after finishing, as if he had already won. Judge Whitman then looked at Marcus's defense lawyer, a young, apprehensive man who appeared to flinch under the judge's stare. The judge said, "Are you going to waste my time sitting here, or do you have anything to say?" The lawyer's voice was hardly audible as he stammered over his remarks. A twinge of frustration ran through Angela. Unless someone took charge, this was not going to work out. Judge Whitman's contempt for Angela grew increasingly clear as the trial went on. He waved his hand dismissively at objections, interrupted her lawyer's comments, and even sighed loudly when Angela stood up to testify as a character witness. The judge, reclining back in his chair, drew lead at Miss Monroe. "I hope you aren't come to squander my time with meaningless platitudes. Here we deal with facts, not emotions." Angela's demeanor was composed but unwavering as she met his eyes. "Your Honor, I'm here to tell the truth," she said calmly. "No more, no less." There were murmurs in the courtroom, but the judge glared at them to stop them. "Very well," he remarked in a sarcastic tone. "Let's listen to your thoughts." With her heels tapping across the shiny floor, Angela took a step forward. She felt as though everyone was watching her, and that their expectations were bearing down on her. She didn't falter, though. She had been trained for years to maintain her composure under duress. Furthermore, she had no intention of being frightened by a haughty judge. She described the circumstances surrounding Marcus's detention with assurance and clarity, presenting a picture of a guy who had been unfairly singled out. However, Judge Whitman interrupted her each time she attempted to go into further detail, his tone becoming increasingly angry. He laughed condescendingly and added, "Miss Monroe, you seem to think you're some sort of law enforcement expert. Tell me, are you just another armchair activist, or do you have any real experience in the field?" A flash of rage ignited in Angela's chest, but she suppressed it. Not yet, and not at this moment. The judge's laughing reverberated in her ears as she went back to her seat. She looked at Marcus, who had whitened his knuckles from holding the table. "It's not over," she said firmly in a whisper. "It's not over, I assure you." Judge Whitman had no idea that the woman he had dismissed so readily was far more complex than she seemed. And the truth will eventually break through his arrogant facade. The energy of the courtroom was a live, breathing entity, throbbing with unsaid words and heavy with tension. As though counting down to an impending explosion, each tick of the grand clock that was positioned high above the judge's bench appeared louder than the one before it. Sitting peacefully, Angela Monroe's poise contrasted sharply with the emotional agony that lay underneath her serene facade. She had previously been under a lot of pressure, but never like this. Not in any situation where the stakes were so high. The leather of Judge Bernard Whitman's chair creaked under his weight as he leaned back across the room. He tapped his pen against the edge of his desk, a tiny but sharp reminder of his power, and his face was one of thinly veiled contempt. Angela's presence in his courtroom was being contested, not merely dismissed. Judge Whitman responded in a condescending tone. "All right, Miss Monroe. Now that you've had your say, let's return to the main topic, which is your brother's flagrant disobedience of the law." Beneath the table, Angela's hands clenched into fists, her knuckles pressed against her thighs. She let out a slow breath, a method she had developed over years of handling stressful situations. She told herself, "Take charge of the moment. Don't let the moment control you." She had lived by this motto, which had helped her get through difficult Secret Service assignments. However, it was like balancing on a tightrope over a pit of vipers in this courtroom, where the judge was staring at you. Daniel Reed, the prosecutor, stood up once more, fiddling with his lapel as if he were getting ready for a comeback. He spoke in a smooth, measured voice. "I think we've had enough of theatrics for one day, Your Honor. The defendant's resistance to arrest is evident from the evidence. Whether or not there is video, the officer's account is what matters." A sliver of a smile threatened to appear when Angela's lips quirked. She had given the same video a dozen reviews. It was damning, not just obvious. By pushing Marcus without cause and pulling his gun during what ought to have been a simple traffic check, the concerned officer had exacerbated the situation. It wasn't only about the video, though. It was also about bias, power, and the lies that people like Daniel Reed and Judge Whitman told to maintain their status quo. Angela's voice was hardly more than a whisper when she leaned in to speak to her brother. "The narrative they are promoting is unsustainable." Marcus remained calm. "It's not over yet." He nodded, but his uneasiness was evident from the strain in his shoulders. Marcus had consistently been the one with strength and protection. Angela felt a slow-burning rage she hadn't felt in years when she saw him here, helpless and bound by a system set out to fail him. After clearing his throat, the judge looked across the room before returning his attention to Angela. He started by saying, "Miss Monroe, before we proceed, I must ask, what makes you so qualified to speak so passionately about law enforcement procedures? Despite having little practical experience, you exude confidence." The question was oozing with derision and hovered in the air. The audience looked at each other, and several of them shook their heads in shock at the judge's foolishness. Angela's eyes narrowed just enough to show her increasing annoyance as she cocked her head slightly. "Respectfully, Your Honor," she answered equitably. "I think my evidence is self-evident. I was there when it happened, and I've studied the evidence carefully." A flat, humorless laugh echoed around the room as Judge Whitman laughed. You say thoroughly? Nevertheless, you are unable to acknowledge the limitations of your viewpoint. But do keep teaching us, please. After all, I have no doubt that your careful analysis would somehow reverse years of court decisions. The courtroom burst into hushed laughing, the kind of laughter that those who undervalued Angela had been used to. She didn't flinch or respond. Rather, she fixed the judge with her unwavering, unblinking look. The defense lawyer made a weak attempt to present fresh evidence as the afternoon went on. Statements made by witnesses to the arrest and records of the officer's previous misbehavior. Judge Whitman, however, dismissed it with a wave. "This doesn't matter," he said in a decisive tone. "Relitigating the past is not our purpose. We're not here to chase ghosts. We're here to deal with the realities of this case." Angela's hand gripped the table's edge more firmly. This strategy, reduce, deflect, dismiss, was not new to her. It was a tactic intended to deprive the defense of any support and to take control of the story before it changed. And it was effective. Judge Whitman had overlooked one of Angela's advantages, though: her patience. She was come to put an end to it, not to play his game. The court declared a brief recess as the hearing came to an end. Angela got up from her chair and walked out into the hallway, her heels clicking lightly on the marble floor. The strain coiling in her chest was not much relieved by the cooler air outside the courtroom. Marcus trailed closely behind, his voice strained and low. "I'm not sure how much more of this I can handle, Angie. No matter what we say, that man has already made up his mind." She grasped his shoulders as she turned to face him. "Marcus, pay attention to me. This isn't finished yet. You are not alone in this battle." For a time, the weight of his frustration and dread was evident as he searched her gaze. He nodded at last, his shoulders letting her touch them loosen up a little. Angela's thoughts were already racing as she looked back toward the courtroom doors. She had waited long enough, allowing Judge Whitman's conceit to lead him to ruin. It would be time to take action when the court reassembled to prove to the judge and everyone else there who she truly was. And she wouldn't hold back this time. As everyone returned to their places, the courtroom was filled with whispers. The area was once again sealed in an almost claustrophobic atmosphere as the heavy doors moaned shut. Angela Monroe's heels clicked purposefully on the polished marble as she retreated to the defendant's table. Every stride she took appeared purposeful, measured, and deliberate. Marcus trailed behind her, his shoulders a little less stiff than before, but his head down a little. He was reassured by something Angela had said to him during the recess. He held onto it like a lifeline, whatever it was. Shortly afterward, Judge Bernard Whitman returned to the room, his robe fluttering behind him like a cloak of power. His look was one of frustration and self-satisfaction as he sank into his high-back chair. This lawsuit, as he defined it, was really a formality, another cog in the wheel of justice. He gave his gavel a single tap. "The court is back in session," he said, his voice resonating throughout the room. His gaze swept over the room, lingering momentarily on Angela. The corner of his lips twitched with the smallest grin. He thought she would be silent, even defeated, but Angela was never one to live up to the hype. Daniel Reed, the prosecution, made his closing argument right away. His voice was piercing, assured, and practiced. Every word was intended to portray Marcus Monroe as a troublemaker who defied the law and deserved the punishment that the court would surely impose. He waved dismissively at the defense's earlier attempt to introduce evidence, claiming it was unrelated to the facts and a distraction. Angela kept a close eye on him, her eyes unwavering and steady. Each of his words seemed like a brick put to the wall Marcus had to scale. However, Angela wasn't yet concerned. She had spent years learning how to be patient and wait for the appropriate time to act, and that time was drawing near. Judge Whitman leaned forward and rested his elbows on the bench when Reed eventually took a seat. As usual, there was a hint of contempt in his tone. "Before we make a decision, is there anything the defense has to say at the last minute?" Angela looked at the defense lawyer, who paused, obviously disturbed by the judge's contemptuous demeanor. Angela got up from her chair before he could say anything. "Your Honor," she remarked in a composed yet strong tone, "I want to speak directly to the court." The judge's countenance was a mix of annoyance and laughter as he raised an eyebrow. "I think I've given you plenty opportunity to express your opinions, Miss Monroe. I advise you to take a seat unless you have something fresh or pertinent to share." Angela remained steadfast. As she took a step forward, the sound of her heels clicking on the floor reverberated around the suddenly quiet room. She started, "With all due respect, Your Honor," her voice just sharp enough to draw attention. "I believe this court should hear something I have to say that is really pertinent." Clearly displeased, the judge slumped back in his chair. "Very well," he sighed and motioned for her to continue. "I have other cases to hear, so hurry up." Angela moved to the middle of the courtroom and looked around before focusing on Judge Whitman. She sensed that everyone was watching her, and the tension in the room was growing. She seemed unfazed by it, though. Rather, she extracted a little black wallet from her jacket pocket and opened it with a practiced ease. Gleaming like a beacon in the darkened courtroom, the bright badge inside caught the light. "My name is Special Agent Angela Monroe, United States Secret Service," she said in a steady, precise voice. Gasps and whispers filled the room as a wave of astonishment swept through the audience like wildfire. In an instant, the prosecutor's confidence vanished, and his jaw noticeably stiffened. In stunned stillness, even the defense lawyer, who had been struggling through the case, looked up. But Judge Whitman sat motionless in his chair, his face a mix of incredulity and mounting discomfort. He seemed to be at a loss for words for the first time that day, and his sneer wavered. Angela didn't hold off until he answered. She went on, her tone steady yet firm. "I have served our nation for the past 10 years, defending its laws and defending its leaders. And I refuse to watch as justice is twisted in this courtroom, or any courtroom, to suit a story of bias and power." The judge's voice faltered a little, but at last he found it. His tone lost its sense of authority as he said, "Agent Monroe, I don't see how your qualifications apply to this situation." A small smile that barely reached Angela's eyes curled her lips. "Your Honor," she answered, "they're very relevant. Due to the fact that they relate to my background, my moral character, and my capacity to spot instances of power abuse." The judge was challenged to answer her remarks, which lingered in the air like a challenge. However, he was unable to do so. Rather, there was a tense quiet in the room as everyone's gaze shifted between Angela and the man who had so haughtily disregarded her just seconds before. Angela looked steadily at the jury. "As a sister, a witness, and a supporter of the legal system, I came here today. I am here, however, because I understand what it takes to stand up for what is right, no matter the cost. There is nothing illegal about Marcus Monroe. Like so many people who resemble him, he is a man who was unfairly singled out, and I will not allow that injustice to continue in this court." One could feel the tension in the room. It rose with each word Angela said. Judge Whitman's hands were clutching the sides of his bench as if to support himself, and his face had become an ugly shade of crimson. Finally, in a strained voice, he replied, "You've made your point, Agent Monroe. However, grandstanding is not appropriate in this court." With her badge still on display, Angela took a step closer, her presence imposing. "Truth belongs in this court," she added, lowering her voice to a whisper that could still be heard clearly across the room. "And it's time for someone to share it." Judge Whitman was silent for the first time that day, as if the weight of all Angela had spoken had squeezed the oxygen out of the room. The courtroom hung in startled quiet, now casting a long shadow over the proceedings. The badge she carried shone beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, a small but clear mark of authority. Angela stood her ground, her demeanor unwavering, her presence dominating. Marcus saw his sister at the defendant's table, feeling both relief and wonder. Although he had always thought Angela was strong, he had not felt hopeful in weeks until he seen her calmly oppose the judge's haughtiness. He let himself think that they might win for the first time since the trial started. Judge Bernard Whitman shuffled uneasily in his high-backed chair across the room. His hands clenched around the seat's arms until his knuckles were white. A thin line that revealed his uneasiness had long since replaced the slight smirk that had played on his lips earlier. He had been able to operate with impunity for years, using his gavel as a weapon to quiet people he believed were not deserving of respect. But now that he was seeing Angela Monroe's cool defiance, a strange feeling began to seep in, terror. The quiet was broken by Angela's quiet yet sharp voice. With calm and measured words, she said, "Your Honor, you previously inquired as to my qualifications for speaking on law enforcement issues. Let me explain the question in detail." She moved forward, bringing herself closer to the bench of the judge. The onlookers leaned closer, clearly interested. The court stenographer, unable to take her eyes off the keys, hesitated for a second. "I have been a special agent with the United States Secret Service for the last 10 years, Angela added steadily. "During that period, I have protected national leaders, carried out investigations, and maintained the values of justice upon which this nation was built. My badge represents a dedication to justice, truth, and the rule of law in addition to being a sign of power." Every syllable of her remarks carried weight as they reverberated across the room. Daniel Reed, the prosecutor, shifted uneasily in his chair, his former assurance now tinged with anxiety. He looked at the judge, quietly wishing that he would take back the tale. However, the sheer weight of Angela's presence seemed to freeze Judge Whitman, dulling his normally sharp tongue. Angela looked across the faces of the jury as she focused on them. Her tone softened but did not lose its intensity as she stated, "Today you have been asked to make a judgment. However, when the balance is shifted before the trial even starts, how can we expect justice to be served? Because of the color of his skin, rather than his acts, my brother Marcus has been portrayed as a criminal. And the arresting officer wasn't the first to exhibit this bias. It penetrates this courtroom as well as every other level of this institution." As the impact of what she had spoken sank in, a murmur shook the audience. A kind-eyed, middle-aged woman who was a juror squirmed uneasily in her chair. As if reviewing everything she had heard thus far, she looked first at the judge and then back at Angela. Judge Whitman tried to regain control by clearing his throat. "Miss Monroe," he said, his voice a little shaky. With a stern tone, Angela corrected him. "I, Agent Monroe." He was immediately silenced by the slap-like correction. "And I'm not done, Your Honor, with all due respect." The judge opened his mouth, then shut it again. His face was a mixture of embarrassment and rage as he reclined in his chair. For the first time in his lengthy career, he had no control over how his own courtroom proceeded. Angela went back to the defendant's table and carefully laid her badge down on the wood, gleaming in the light as though daring anybody to question it. It sat there as a silent reminder of her power. Leaning forward and putting her hands flat on the table, she spoke to the whole room. With a firm voice, she stated, "The evidence is clear. Marcus is shown getting unjustly pushed to the ground in the footage. The harsh behavior of the cop has been attested to by witnesses. However, this court has decided to disregard those facts in a narrative that aligns with a deeply rooted bias." She stood up, allowing her words to register, and then went on. "However, I refuse to let a system that prioritizes power over justice railroad my brother or anybody else. Never, ever today." The tension reached a boiling point when the room burst into murmurs. With a composed yet firm stance, Angela took a step back and went back to her seat next to Marcus. His eyes were filled with pride and gratitude as he gazed at her. For a brief period, Judge Whitman sat still, his face flushed with a mixture of humiliation and rage. His voice was not as authoritative as usual when he eventually spoke. He spoke slowly as he said, "Agent Monroe, your great credentials do not give you the authority to discredit this court." Angela looked up at him, her face unreadable. "Your Honor, I'm not here to discredit this court. I'm here to make sure justice gets done. If something makes you uneasy, you might want to think about why." The judge's jaw tightened as his lips formed a narrow line. He looked over at the prosecutor, who was now hurriedly going through his notes, trying to work out a strategy to get back on track. However, there was nothing he could do or say to reverse the power imbalance that Angela had brought about. The air was heavy with expectancy as the courtroom sat in tight stillness. The entire room was aware that something significant had just happened, but the full impact had not yet been felt. Judge Whitman's actions were rigid and robotic as he straightened his robe. With less intensity than normal, he declared, "This court will take a recess. We'll get together again soon." With a bang of his gavel, He got up and left the room, his robe fluttering behind him. However, the gavel's intended sound of authority sounded hollow, like the final scream of a man who had lost command of his own realm. Angela's face was unreadable as she watched him leave. She put a comforting hand on Marcus' shoulder as she turned to face him. Not by a long shot, she murmured gently, "This isn't over." And Angela realized that the fight was far from over as the judge's doors closed behind her. However, for the first time, things had changed and justice seemed attainable. Long after Judge Whitman had rushed out, the gavel strike still reverberated softly in the ears of those in the courtroom, leaving the place in stunned quiet. Among the onlookers, whispers of conversation began. However, Angela Monroe stayed sat at the defense table, her face placid and unflappable. She'd survived storms much worse than this one. Marcus sat quietly next to her, his gaze focused on her as if seeking comfort. "You really rattled him, Angie," he whispered softly as he leaned in her direction. "Never in my life have I witnessed a judge appear so shaken." Angela took a while to reply. Rather, with deliberate and controlled movements, she reached for a glass of water on the table. Before putting it down again, she took a tiny sip. She spoke softly but firmly to her brother only then. "Marcus, this isn't about startling him. The goal is to reveal the truth. Furthermore, the arrogant are often uncomfortable with the truth." Marcus nodded, but it was still clear that he was uncomfortable. "Is it sufficient in your opinion? Do you believe he will pay attention?" A little fracture in Angela's typically stern exterior appeared as her lips curled into the slightest of smiles. "Marcus, judges like Whitman don't pay attention. They respond, and when they are cornered, their own arrogance causes them to either double down or crumble. In any case, we're prepared." No one anticipated how long the recess would last. The Fulton County Courthouse's hallways were bustling with activity outside the courtroom doors. At this point, reporters who had previously given the case little attention were clustered together, cameras and notepad ready. The courthouse was a flurry of conjecture after word of Angela's disclosure spread like wildfire. With her hands softly clasped in front of her and her back straight, Angela stayed seated at the defense table. The questioning looks of the spectators who had lingered in the gallery did not make her wince. While some gazed at her with awe, others did so with suspicion. However, she emanated a subtle authority that no one could ignore. The bailiff's voice boomed as the hefty double doors finally opened. "The court is back in session, so get up." Angela rose slowly, her steps purposeful. Marcus stood beside her, breathing shallowly but steadily. Judge Whitman came into the room with a heated face, but a firmly controlled look. It was evident that he still lacked the whole confidence he had previously possessed, even if the hiatus had allowed him time to gather himself. With his gavel firmly grasped in one hand, he sat down. He just sat there for a while, looking around the room as if he dared anyone to question his authority. However, Angela could see the fractures in his demeanor, including a tightness around his jaw and a little trembling in his fingers. Judge Whitman began, his voice measured carefully before we proceeded. "I think it's important to remind this court of the decorum guidelines. Despite her impressive qualifications, Agent Monroe is not exempt from the standards of behavior required in this courtroom." Angela's demeanor remained unchanged as she met his eyes steadily. She remained still, letting the silence descend upon the room. The judge was more frightened by that than by any explosion ever could be. It was control, not disobedience. Daniel Reed, the prosecutor, seized the chance to intervene. "Your Honor," he started to stand up, "I want to ask that we return our attention to the case's facts. Despite its strength, Agent Monroe's testimony ultimately has little bearing on the accusations." Angela's mouth clenched, but she said nothing. She was familiar with the downplay, redirect, and decrease strategy. It served as a guide for individuals who thought their authority was eroding. However, she was also aware that even the strongest layer of pride might be penetrated by facts. Encouraged by Angela's presence, the defense lawyer stood up. "Your Honor," he responded in a more strong voice. "Agent Monroe's testimony is crucial in addition to being pertinent. These are more than simply thoughts based on the witnesses she met with and the video evidence she saw. This court has an obligation to take these factual facts into account. Judge Whitman let out a sigh that was laden with annoyance. His voice cracked a little as he snapped, "Enough. We will go over the facts again, but I will not let this court become a show." The bailiff moved forward and put the video evidence on the projector in the courtroom. The shaky video of Marcus's arrest appeared on the screen as it flickered to life. Despite having already committed every detail to memory, Angela watched intently, her gaze sweeping over each frame. The cop who had unjustly escalated the situation was the target of the damaging video, not Marcus. As the video began to play, the courtroom became silent. The room reverberated with the officer's severe orders and Marcus's composed answers. The scene where Marcus was pushed to the ground was captured in slow motion, his body thudding sickeningly against the tarmac. The audience erupted in gasps and then nervous whispers. Angela looked at the jury, observing the fluctuating looks on their faces as they displayed uncertainty, discomfort, and even remorse. The truth was starting to surface. Judge Whitman leaned forward with his hands folded tightly in front of him as the film came to a close. His voice was strained as he stated, "The evidence is clear. However, this does not justify the defendant's behavior." Slowly and deliberately, Angela got up from her chair. "Your Honor," she said steadily, "the proof exonerates my brother, not merely absolves him of responsibility for his acts. The reality of a system that does not uphold justice for everyone is what this court has seen today, not just the facts." Her comments were heavy and unwavering as they hung in the air. With the weight of her remark bearing down on them like a stone, the audience sat in quiet. Judge Whitman's fists gripped the edge of his bench as his countenance grew gloomy. "Agent Monroe," he stated in a cold tone, "you are treading carefully." Angela took a step forward him and met his eyes. "No, Your Honor," she responded in a firm voice. "The truth is the only line that matters, and that's the one I'm walking." The tension reached a boiling point as whispers broke out in the courtroom. With a harsh and startling sound, Judge Whitman struck his gavel. He trembled and yelled, "Order. My courtroom will be in order." However, his voice had lost its authority and had instead taken on a desperate tone. With a composed yet determined attitude, Angela went back to her seat. She had fulfilled her destiny. The system now had to determine whether it would rise to the occasion or break under the weight of its own shortcomings. The judge's gavel dropped again. This time, however, it seemed more like a man's desperate attempt to keep hold of a collapsing facade than a proclamation of power. Angela put her hand on Marcus's shoulder as the court adjourned for the day. "We're closer than we've ever been, but this isn't the end," she whispered softly. With a newfound sense of hope in his eyes, Marcus nodded. He gave himself permission to think that justice might possibly be possible for the first time in weeks. And Angela realized that the battle was far from finished as the courthouse doors closed behind them. But whatever came next, she was prepared. Angela Monroe and her brother Marcus were walking side by side in the strangely silent hallways of the Fulton County Courthouse, their footsteps resonating on the smooth marble floors. Angela's expression was unreadable and her face stayed composed. However, Marcus could feel the slight strain in her jaw's rigidity and the way her fingers flexed slightly, as if they were holding an unseen weight. The silence was finally broken by Marcus. "Will he genuinely allow the facts to alter anything, in your opinion?" His voice was unsure and low as he inquired. "Or is this just another program where they act as though they are paying attention, but they already know how it will end?" Angela stopped and looked at him. Her features were softly illuminated by the fluorescent lights overhead, and she looked at her brother's face for a while. "I've been in rooms with people who think they control everything, people with power, influence, and arrogance to match," she remarked softly, referring to Marcus. "One thing unites them all. When the truth is revealed, they all fall apart. Judge Whitman is no exception. He is aware of the walls closing in." Marcus's shoulders drooped as he gazed at her. However, what if he manages to pervert this somehow? Unable to complete the sentence, he trailed off. "What if he just—" Angela grounded him by putting a hand on his shoulder. "We will untwist this if he twists it. We press harder if he suppresses the truth. Marcus, it's not just about you. It concerns all those who have entered a courtroom and been assessed before they have even spoken. And until they see it, I won't give up. Her statements were uncompromising and strong. And Marcus gave himself permission to smile a little for the first time that day. You always have something to say, he whispered. A small smile flickered across Angela's lips. It's a part of the landscape. The mood had changed by the time they got back to the courtroom. There was initially only a little undertone of stress in the whispers that the onlookers exchanged with one another. When Judge Whitman walked into the room, the bailiff's gaze remained fixed on him. However, Angela sensed it and knew it was more than the consequences of her previous disclosure. Judge Whitman sat down, his posture more rigid than before. He had a deliberately neutral face. The way his fingers delicately tapped the gavel, as if to test its weight, and the thin lines of strain around his eyes were visible to Angela. The room was quiet save for the sharp, harsh sound he made as he cleared his throat. With an air of coercion in his voice, he declared, "This court is ready to hear closing arguments. I would, however, remind everyone in attendance that this is a court of law and not a forum for theatrical performances or personal complaints." From the other side of the room, Angela looked directly into his eyes, her face immovable. He was wrong if he believed that his barely concealed warning would scare her. Daniel Reed, the prosecutor, stood up to make his final remarks. His customary self-assurance was back, or at least skillfully displayed, as he straightened his tie and walked to the middle of the courtroom. "Your Honor, members of the jury," he said in a polished and well-practiced voice. "Today's events have been a diversion. By offering emotional appeals and unrelated testimony that is unrelated to the charges against the defendant, the defense has tried to divert attention from the case's facts." As he talked, he paced slowly while looking around the jury. Simply put, Marcus Monroe resisted being taken into custody. This is supported by the evidence. This is corroborated by the officer's testimony. The law is plain, notwithstanding the defense's desire to cloud the issue. Angela kept a close eye on him, her face expressionless. She didn't even blink, much alone flinch or interrupt. Long ago, she had discovered that silence could have its own power, and now she used it carefully. With a flourish, Reed wrapped off his remarks and smirked as he went back to his seat. But when he sat down, Angela noticed the smallest fracture in his control, the flicker of doubt in his eyes. Angela's hands clasped in front of her. She leaned forward slightly as the defense lawyer stood up to speak. Angela recognized that the young lawyer's initial stand had resulted in a quiet determination that had replaced her earlier trepidation. He was using the confidence she had given him. The lawyer started off steadily. "Your Honor, members of the jury, this case is about accountability, not about avoiding arrest. It's about identifying instances of power abuse by persons in positions of authority. And it's about making sure that justice is a value we support rather than merely a term we use." He pointed to the screen that had previously shown the video proof. "You've heard the testimony and seen the video. Arrest was not resisted by Marcus Monroe. He suffered abuse, humiliation, and false accusations. And it is the responsibility of this court to recognize that fact." Angela looked at the jury as he talked. She could see the softening of their expressions as a result of his comments. The way their eyes moved in what appeared to be comprehension toward Marcus. With a serene conviction in his voice, the lawyer concluded his remarks. "Courage is necessary for justice. I implore you to have that bravery today." There was a heavy hush in the room when the lawyer sat down. Everyone's attention was drawn to Judge Whitman, who sat still with an unreadable countenance. He just stared at the papers before him for a long time, his fingertips grazing the edge of his gavel. At last he raised his head, scanning the room. "Now, the jury will deliberate," he said in a tense voice. "Until a verdict is rendered, the court is adjourned." Before anyone could say anything more, he blasted his gavel and hurried to his feet, leaving the room. The room burst into soft whispers as the bailiff told everyone to stay seated until the judge had departed. Angela turned to face Marcus, her eyes piercing, but her face composed. "This is it," she muttered. Marcus nodded, his hands twitching a little on the table. "Now we wait." Do you think the jury will notice?" Angela steadied him by placing a hand on his arm. Marcus, they saw it. All they need to do is determine whether they have the courage to follow through. And Angela sat there as the courtroom gradually cleared away, her thoughts going over every little thing, every second, every scenario. She was aware that the battle was far from done, but she was also aware that even in the most gloomy situations, the truth may find a way to shine through. They could only wait for the time being. It was painful to wait. Hours went by, the courthouse clock's hands moving with a slowness that was almost mocking. With her hands folded neatly in her lap, Angela Monroe sat next to her brother Marcus at the defense table. Though she maintained her cool, her mind was racing with ideas. This was a risky scenario, and she knew better than to forecast it. The people in charge of the story were favored by the system, not the truth, and it had been dominated for so long by Judge Whitman and those like him. Marcus shifted next to her, his big shoulders bearing the burden of doubt. He broke the silence by whispering, "What if this doesn't work out for us, Angie?" Angela looked at him calmly and steadily. "We continue to fight if it doesn't," she answered quietly. "Marcus, this is only one battle. This room and this verdict are only two fronts in the fight for justice. This is not unique to you." She was speaking not only to him, but also to herself. She had to have faith in truth's ability to endure in a system that was set up to stifle it. At last, the bailiff entered the courtroom and opened the door. With a voice that sliced through the tension like a razor, he shouted for everyone to rise. A verdict has been rendered by the jury. The air was heavy with expectation as the audience shuffled to their feet. Angela smoothed the front of her blazer and gently stood up. Marcus was standing next to her, his hands shaking a little. Angela grounded him by placing a steadying touch on his arm. Judge Bernard Whitman walked in with a deliberately neutral demeanor. However, as he sat down, Angela saw the small tightness in his motions and the way his eyes averted from hers. The courtroom went silent as the gavel cracked sharply against the desk. Judge Whitman ordered everyone to take a seat. The creak of wooden benches filled the silence as the room obeyed in unison. A middle-aged woman with graying hair and an anxious manner appeared as the jury's foreperson. She had a folded piece of paper in her hands that looked incredibly small for the weight it held. Her voice trembled a little as she spoke, clearing her throat. "The jury has unanimously decided, Your Honor," she said. The tempest of emotions behind Angela's serene demeanor was concealed by her steady heartbeat. She looked at Marcus, whose jaw was clenched tightly as he stared straight ahead. This was the time that would decide not only his destiny, but also a tiny bit of justice in a system that had let so many people down. "Please, will the defendant stand up?" Judge Whitman gave an order in an emotionless voice. Marcus arose, and for some reason, the judge's stare made his bulky figure appear smaller. Angela stood next to him in a silent, but impactful gesture of support. The foreperson's hands trembled a little as she unfolded the page. She looked at the judge, then at Marcus, and then she read out loud. With her voice shaking, she stated, "We find the defendant, Marcus Monroe, not guilty on the charge of resisting arrest." For a minute, the words lingered in the air, as though the room itself required some time to absorb them. Then a flood of whispers raced across the gallery like a dam bursting. While some gasped in shock, others did so in relief. For a moment, Angela closed her eyes and let go of a breath she hadn't even aware she was holding. Marcus's knees gave down a little at her side, and she put a strong grasp on his arm to steady him. Judge Whitman banged his gavel and said, "Order. In this courtroom, I shall maintain order." The tension did not lessen, but the noise did. The judge's lips were squeezed into a narrow line, and his face looked taut. Something she couldn't quite place filled his eyes as he looked at Angela. Maybe resentment or the pain of being outwitted. In any case, she didn't flinch as she looked into his eyes. "The defendant may leave," Whitman remarked abruptly. The words came out with clenched teeth. "We've adjourned this court." Without another comment, he slammed the gavel one last time and stood up, his robe fluttering as he walked out of the chamber. When the judge left, the courtroom exploded. Marcus's eyes were wide with shock as he turned to face Angela. His voice cracked as he murmured, "Angie, we succeeded." "No," Angela answered quietly, her face determined but warm. "The truth did it. You did it." After weeks of anxiety, he finally felt release as he pulled her into a tight embrace, his shoulders trembling. Strong and sturdy, Angela's arms were a silent anchor in the storm as she held him. Reporters started to crowd around them, their cameras flashing and their questions flying. Angela paid little attention to them, concentrating solely on her brother. They didn't have time to take advantage of this. This was Marcus's chance to take back his life, his humanity, and his dignity. The chilly Atlanta air hit them like a blast as they walked out of the courthouse. Angela led Marcus to a more peaceful section of the stairs, but the clamor of the crowd followed them outside. Her hands rested lightly on his shoulders as she turned to face him. "Marcus," she continued in a firm but gentle voice, "this isn't the end. This is only the start. We cannot stop here, because what happened to you is systematic and not exceptional. We must ensure that no one else experiences this." Marcus nodded, his face displaying a mix of determination and thankfulness. "I'll fight, just like you, Angie, no matter what." Angela grinned, displaying a unique tenderness in her often reserved manner. "Marcus, you've already battled and prevailed." Looking back, she saw the courtroom, its massive building serving as a reminder of the struggles to come. But for the time being, she gave herself permission to relax and take a deep breath, knowing that they had made a tiny but important step in the direction of justice. And with her brother at her side, Angela Monroe left the courthouse as the sun started to set, illuminating the city in crimson and gold hues, prepared for whatever lay ahead. With a sea of reporters, activists, and bystanders on either side, Angela and Marcus climbed the courthouse stairs, which were still humming with activity. The constant bursting of camera flashes, which resembled fireworks, served as a reminder that this moment had taken place outside of a single courtroom. Angela maintained her composure while gently guiding Marcus through the confusion with her arm, protecting him from the intense scrutiny. A reporter yelled, "Now that your brother has been found not guilty, what are you going to do? Will you take the offending cop to task?" Angela continued to walk with her eyes fixated on the future. Her voice was calm, yet firm as she stated, "Today is about my brother and his freedom. Right now we're taking a break, but the fight for justice is far from over." As they got to the foot of the steps, the audience dispersed, giving the siblings a little break from the limelight. Marcus was led by Angela to a waiting car, its sleek black body gleaming in the last of the sunlight. Marcus paused and turned to look at Angela as a driver came out with the door open. "I don't know how to thank you for what you've done," he murmured quietly. "Angie, without you, I wouldn't be standing here." With a steady glance, Angela put a hand on his shoulder. "Marcus, you don't have to thank me. Since you're my brother, I will always defend you. What comes next, however, is up to you. Be the man I know you are, and use this freedom to change the world." "I will," he said, swallowing hard as he nodded. A few months later, Angela was sitting in her small but tidy apartment, going over papers that were arranged on her dining table. Following Marcus's acquittal, the case against the arresting officer had gathered momentum due to public outcry and the indisputable evidence that was presented in court. Judicial experts, activists, and even some MPs had taken notice and demanded more thorough research on the systematic flaws in the judicial system. Angela had assumed a role she hadn't expected to play in silence. An advocate not only for her brother, but also for others who had suffered because of a systemic fault. She spoke at community forums, spoke with legal reform organizations, and contributed to the increasing need for accountability while juggling her newfound mission with her career as a Secret Service agent. She looked away from the papers when her phone chimed. Marcus was the one. He said, "Hey, Angie," with a freshness in his voice that she hadn't heard in a long time. "I only wanted to inform you. Today, I shared my tale at a youth facility. Many of those children are experiencing what I did. I believe it had an impact." Angela grinned, her chest swelled with pride. "I'm proud of you, Marcus. That's incredible." He went on, "You ought to have seen their faces. I informed them that although the battle isn't finished, it doesn't imply that we should give up." With her heart full, Angela reclined in her chair. "Marcus, you're doing well. Keep it up." Before disconnecting up, they spoke for a few more minutes, and Angela sat in her apartment's silence, thinking. Moments like this reminded her why she persisted on the long and difficult road ahead, which was full of battles yet to be fought. A few weeks later, Angela was in stark relief as she stood in front of a crowded auditorium, illuminated by the stage's brilliant lights. For a panel discussion on systemic transformation, the room was packed with activists, students, attorneys, and members of the community. Angela had been asked to speak as a sister, a witness, and a champion of justice, not as a Secret Service agent. The audience became silent as she took the podium and started speaking. She stated that justice is not a given. She spoke in a firm but confident tone. It is something that we must demand and fight for. Although my brother's tale is only one of many, it serves as a reminder that change is achievable if we band together and refuse to be silent. She took a moment to process the words. It's not just about me or Marcus. It concerns everyone who has experienced exclusion, silence, or unfair judgment. It's about creating a system that prioritizes truth over power and humanity over prejudice. The audience cheered, but Angela stayed motionless, looking around the room. She was aware of the responsibility and weight of what she had said. But she also had optimism, a silent but steadfast hope that things may turn around, that the rippling effects of this moment might become waves. Angela knew the battle was far from over as she retreated from the podium, the cheers erupting around her. But she felt ready for the first time in a long time. She had discovered her calling in standing up for what was right as well as in defending others. Angela Monroe left the stage with her head held high, prepared to take on whatever came next, as the audience stood up and joined in a chorus of support.
Disclaimer. This channel stands against all forms of intolerance, discrimination, racism, and violations of human rights. The stories shared here are original creations, developed to encourage reflection, understanding, and constructive dialogue. All content is produced with a commitment to respecting diversity and honoring human dignity.